So welcome everybody. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Toby Boraman, so I'm going to speak about restructuring, or destructuring as it was called in the 1980s. This is a big shift imposed on the entire New Zealand workforce pretty much, particularly manufacturing, particularly blue collar. Heaps of jobs were lost, so that's why it's called destructuring by unionists, including Jim Knox, but many others as well. There's this huge destruction of jobs that happened in the 80s. And one of the earliest struggles against restructuring was the Monterey Bridge lockout in 1978 to 1980. This was like labourers and carpenters and so forth who got locked out over a battle for redundancy. But I'm not going to talk much about that. What I'm going to do is a big, broad overview. So does that come up? So yeah, to bring what we were talking about earlier, how do we explain we went from this huge, massive struggle in 1980, this massive victory that wasn't supposed to happen, when workers and unions took on the government and won. So that wasn't after 1951, the lesson of the union movement was you never take on the government. But they did, they won. They won through this tremendous bottom-up, rank-and-file democracy, a participatory democracy from below. And we saw that film, that magnificent film about that. So what happened? How did we go from there to these massive job losses only 5 years later? So at Kinleith, what happened, and this is a strategy that first happened with the meatworks, this is the capitalist class working, learning off each other, different strands of capital, and so what they did, they went to workers and said, we're going to shut down your entire mill. But we might let it open if you agree to these cuts in jobs. So they went around pretty much all large working class workplaces, if you like, particularly blue collar ones, and they shed jobs. So as it's got up there, there was 3,000, somebody said 5,000 jobs at Kinleith? I thought, I think it was 3,500 I read. 5,500. Right, so it was cut by, as it says up there, I think, what is it, down to 1,100, I think? Yeah. So this is 300 now, yeah, and that's for automation, that's another thing as well. Okay, next slide. So this, to bring it in a bit of personalist perspective, so I'm from Dunedin, which was an industrial town. It got de-industrialised, which means, the same thing as restructuring. So where I grew up, there's this little valley called Kaikoura Valley. We used to call it Kaikoura Valley, which is written about in Shane Carter's autobiography, if you've ever, from Straight Jacket Fits, that area of Dunedin. So this whole area from 79, when the Roslyn woolen mills got shut, so 400 largely women worked there, completely shut, and then within about 10 years this entire valley got made redundant. And so it was so I was alive at the time, of course, even though I'm an outsider to this period, but it was a really tough time. So I remember going to high school, late 80s, early 90s, it was vicious. Pretty much everybody got made redundant, their parents got made redundant, both of them, and it was a really hard time to grow up. It was a violent time, to be honest, and this was because of this violence done to people. And then I went to university and then I found nobody there knew about it. It was really weird to meet more middle-class people, even though I'm from a middle-class background, I grew up in a working-class area, they didn't know about it. It was this complete cultural shock. And that got me into politics, this sort of anger from what happened to people. It was a vicious attack. And it was not a nice time to grow up. Because a lot of people took it out on themselves. There was a lot of violence on the streets in Dunedin. So it's not a university town, by the way, Dunedin. The university town's only one small part of it's grown since, but at this time Dunedin was a huge, massive decline. I remember for 20 years I don't think the population went up. Dunedin was one of the industrial hubs of New Zealand, and it all went away and moved to Auckland, a lot of it. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about what destructuring is. I know I don't have much time, but I'm just going to talk about two big phases of destructuring. The first one is associated not with Muldoon, it happens about the late 70s, early 80s, the first wave, where there was a lot of resistance, and the resistance was quite effective. The second wave is the deeper wave, associated with full-on neoliberalism from about the mid-80s on, but also a huge capitalist class offensive. I'm going to talk about how people try to resist it. So this is a good photo from one of the first meatworks that closed, the Pātea Meatworks in 1982, a couple of despondent workers there. I do really think we have to think of this as a structural violence. It was, as Ken Finlay, who was a meatworkers official, who helped out with the Pātea dispute, said it's corporate terrorism. And it was. It really hit these small towns really hard. So, the working class communities like the Tony hit hugely, Porirua, Pātea, Tokoroa, you could go on, Murupara, Kawerau, all these single rituary towns or suburbs dependent on these industries just got savaged. Okay, next slide. So I'm sorry I'm a bit disorganised, I haven't had much time to organise this, but destructuring goes by various names. You call it restructuring, rationalising, all this buzzwords you remember from the 1980s, efficiency, flexible labour arrangements and so forth. Workplace reform was another one. All these buzzwords came out. Computerisation was another one, automation, mechanisation. So, they were trying to, basically, what's behind these processes is that they're trying to cut a whole lot of jobs, they're trying to make things more profitable, to make their companies more internationally competitive, and you do that by cutting jobs, make people work harder and faster for less money. So that's the basic sort of aim of this restructuring process. So you get rid of a whole lot of jobs, and then the people that are left work a lot harder, right? And there's various interpretations around the world about this in academia. So some of you might have gone to university. They talk about neoliberalism there. Funnily enough, they always see neoliberalism as some type of state-centred idea, an ideology that's coming from politicians. They leave the capitalist class out of it. You cannot study neoliberalism, in my opinion, without studying the capitalist class and what they're doing, because the two are interlinked. And so I would see neoliberalism as a movement, a material movement, not an idea of the capitalist class, to enrich themselves. And that's what they were explicitly trying to do, to enrich themselves, to transfer wealth from working class people towards themselves as well. And this is an explicit aim of neoliberalism, right? That's what's really driving it. So that's kind of my interpretation of it. It might be a bit controversial for some people, but that's what I'm arguing. So I think so 80s was a period of class war, waged by capital against workers. So you had this huge, massive working class rebellion in the 1970s from 68 onwards, and this is can be seen as their response to it. And I think what's really important to realise is that for my generation, when we worked in these really overworked jobs where, you're doing the jobs of 3 people when you go home and you're utterly exhausted, right? There was a time before this period that I've learned from, they were talking to a lot of people doing oral history, where jobs were a lot nicer. Workers looked after each other. This is particularly big workplaces, but it had this tremendous sort of workplace whānau and solidarity of people looking after each other, right? And looking after each other's job. And I think that made jobs really fun. It means you could take time off work occasionally and other people would cover for you. And that sort of, I think, an essence of this restructuring is to attack that sources of workers' power, right? To break up these subversive multi-ethnic bonds that workers had developed over a long period of time under the long boom in places like the meat works and paper mills and so forth. And they want to break up these bonds and divide workers. So that's the key aim of restructuring. And then you bring in the Japanese work methods where you break workers up into teams and make them more competitive, bring in performance pay and all these type of things. So really briefly, I'm going to skip this really briefly, but the social impacts, I think we've got to link inequality today. So this massive inequality we've got today of just 2 white men own as much wealth as the combined wealth of the bottom third, or was it 50%? 50% of the entire population of this country. So this absurd Dickensian 19th century concentration of wealth has its origins in this transfer of wealth from the capitalist class, right? So we've got to link, it's a class inequality. And I think that's and it's an ongoing thing. So when we talk about, the housing crisis, even the move to financial speculation is part of this whole move by international capital to restructure himself, right? So we've got to make the link between what's happening now, 1980s to now, because this is when you have this massive movement, and this is why so many people are struggling. You work 2 jobs and you still can't make the ends meet, and your rent's like 80% of your income, etc., as people know here in Wellington. I think it has its origin. That's the long-term impacts, in my opinion. And this is intersecting inequality. with ethnicity and race, with disability, with gender. So, and they sort of all interlock together and make things much harder. Because this restructuring hit blue-collar people the hardest, disproportionately, hit Māori and Pacifica, who tend to be concentrated in blue-collar workplaces the hardest as well. And then on top of that, you've got the long-term impacts of racism, colonisation, and women as well, blue-collar women in particular, but also it spreads into white-collar workplaces as well with computerisation. You have this big move to the silicon chip in the 80s. So it really does hit people really hard. And this is sort of the root, I think, of all of the problems we have today. So there was a photo of Pātea meat workers again, or freezing workers if you like, receiving the news that their plants were going to close. This is a photo of Southdown, another militant Auckland, well, not so militant by the end actually, freezing works that got shut down in 1980. It was one of the first ones, and this is the workers reading their redundancy, their closure notices. So there's a few quotes of the social impacts about how restructuring hit people in the 80s. I won't read them out, but you can sort of feel that shock and that sort of collective, I'm losing my voice, cheers. The collective shock and trauma of losing your job when you thought you had a job for life, right? Okay, so just a little bit of background stuff about what happened in the 80s. In 70s, we had this massive upturn in working class struggle. So we see this biggest number of workers on strike in New Zealand history in 1979 for the general strike, over 300,000, right? So these are the figures of brought to life. And then in the 80s, you see working days not worked by workers goes up hugely. That's because struggles become a lot more defensive. And they take a lot longer. When the 70s, they were a lot shorter because workers were often winning. They'd get a pay rise, go on strike, wouldn't take that long, etc. But so you have this massive spike in 1986 of, this is actually bigger than 1951, right? And this is because the wage controls are lifted after Muldoon's wage freeze, and the Labour Party also continued it for a while. And so you have this massive wage round of people trying to catch up in a time of high inflation, but also at the same time there's massive fights against restructuring. The biggest one was by meat workers. They had a national strike in 1986, which went for 6 to 8 weeks. It was sort of our version, in a way, of the miners' strike in the UK of 1984 to 85. Also ended in defeat. I'll talk about that soon. But first of all, I want to talk about the first wave. So how am I going for time?
Time's out the window.
Time's out the window, okay. Really quickly.
I would say another 10 minutes.
Okay. So the first round is really remarkable because I think workers fight back and do it quite remarkably well. One amazing example is the reopening of the Southdown Meatworks, which is in Otahuhu. 1980, it was shut down out of the blue. Workers, the Auckland and Tomoana Freezing Workers Union went on strike and actually reopened the plant with a bit of political support from the FOL. So this is a really remarkable strike that hasn't been written about in New Zealand history books much. It's internationally significant because it's very rare for workers to go on strike and then for a plant to be reopened. It only stayed open for 6 months or a year more. I think Ross would know more than me. And then it was shut down again. Another really significant struggle was the 1981 Rixon occupation by clothing workers up in the Vin. So they shut down a whole clothing factory out of the blue, predominantly women workforce there, I think largely Māori. They had a 3-month occupation, the longest workplace occupation in New Zealand history. It was about trying to get redundancy pay. They weren't given any redundancy pay. They did this remarkable occupation. There's a great film about it called Even Dogs Given Bones, so I recommend watching that. Remarkable solidarity. Unfortunately, they didn't get redundancy. The boss just said, I'm not going to give you anything. I've gone into receivership. But they had huge solidarity. This is the time of the Springbok tour, by the way. Huge solidarity and support, even though they got a bit of abuse, apparently. And
What year was that?
1981 Springbok tour. Same time. So these are all stills from that film. It's really worth watching. So what else? Talked about the Maunga Bridge. There are a few other struggles. But overall, And there were quite a few others actually. Another one it was alluded to earlier was TEP workers when they were made redundant. They did a whole lot of occupations, I read, of various Department of Labour officers, I believe. So there was a huge amount of struggle going on, and workers were in a position to struggle because they built up all these multi-ethnic bonds over time. They had compulsory unionism, strong unions, a lot of delegate organising was going on for the first time. You know, people had money, they had secure jobs, and when there was a shock came that they were going to get out of the job, they could actually struggle. So they did win a few fights, but on the whole, there was a bit of a retreat starting to happen. So there was a lack of national resistance after Kinleith, nationally coordinated resistance, unfortunately. A lot of these struggles were fought one workplace by one workplace. The only two examples where you got sort of what I would call class solidarity would be at Kinleith, 1980, and then Ricks in 1981 when you get widespread support. But otherwise, these workers tended to be left by themselves. People would see there's other people's problems. And this was called in the meatworks, freezing works, shedism. So, you know, you had one shed, like Pātea, or Longburn, or Nauranga here in Wellington, or Petone, it was known as Gear, but that was the company name, that's actually Petone Shed. They'd go out, but don't worry about them. And they also fractured into different unions. There was a Auckland Union, which was different from the rest of the New Zealand Meatworkers Union. And then often there was a bit of history of antagonism between the two. I do want to highlight a couple of remarkable campaigns that are a little known. That was alluded to a little bit in some of the earlier stuff. There was a campaign for a shorter working week with no extra pay. I think this was endorsed by the FOL. I think this was an FOL campaign. But actually the Meat Workers Union here in the Wellington district, which was called the West Coast branch, which we went all the way out to Taranaki down to here, actually campaigned and actually won it at Longburn and got a 4 to 5 scheme, which means workers would work 4 days a week for 5 days pay. And Muldoon unfortunately stepped in and abolished it. He said, I'm not going to allow that by law. So there were some really creative things of how to deal with this massive shock of unemployment and what was coming. A lot of job sharing schemes. You've got various unions doing things about it since the 70s when containerisation came in affected the seafarers, and the wharfies. And so they moved to sort of job sharing schemes where workers would have, 1 week on, 1 week off to allow and having equitable sharing between different workers so that you could share the jobs, right? But a lot of these sort of got quashed by the tumult that was coming. So that's a quote from one of the meat workers officials about, saying we nearly got the 4 to 5 scheme. Yeah, but they didn't. And I think one remarkable, I'm trying to look at the positives, so one remarkable success story was a little meatworks in southern Hawke's Bay near Danavert called Oringi. So this was set up by one of the new breeds of capitalists. Part of restructuring was you set up new little plants in rural areas away from the militant sheds, if you like, and you set them up as anti-union sheds, and you try and hire a compliant workforce. So they hired a lot of women, largely Māori women, and they ended up being just more stroppy than the men, right? And this became a militant shed. And the way they had to do the meat workers officials, they were trespassed, there were bullies chasing them, as you can see from that quote up there. They were taken to court. So that's Roger Middlemas, Ray Potros. Ray Potros was later given death threats as Taranaki dairy workers, right? Actual real death threats. So that was a remarkable success story that they managed to reunionise this little anti-union plant that was restructured, which was highly automated and really sped up production. So it was a real success, but unfortunately they weren't able to replicate it at many other plants. So overall I think this was the beginnings of defeat and retreat. And I've talked about shedism. I've got a really long quote up there. I think nobody will have time to read it. But basically, oh my gosh, you cannot read that. It's terrible font. I haven't even looked at it. Sorry. This is the problem. I have a Mac and a PC. But basically, it's somebody saying that from memory, you had this massive retreat when all the factories start to shut down. And they think they can't impose it. And they also think, a lot of union officials think you shouldn't go on strike because they'll shut the place down. So they think, oh my gosh, we have to concede. So this interview subject, who was a meat worker, talked about how there's this massive retreat that's happened ever since then. He talks about 30 years of defeat, right, till the present day. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. And this defeat is the longest lasting one in working class history, longer than 1951. In 1951, by 1968, they rebuilt the unions. We still haven't, I don't think, really been able to really rebuild the unions since this huge defeat that happened. So I'm sorry about the fonts. Okay, now to the huge, massive round of restructuring when you have this sort of, as people who lived through it, this capitalist feeding frenzy. So this is where all the asset strippers came in, like Briley. They had this they were enabled by the Labour government by financial deregulation. They just went in, took over a whole lot of industries, shut a whole lot of them down, threw a whole lot of workers out. And it was just an avalanche of attacks, if you like. But workers did resist it. The biggest one and the most important one was the meat workers' strike when they tried to bring in new technology in 1986. It lasted 6 to 8 weeks. It's the biggest struggle in New Zealand since 51. Unfortunately, it was defeated. There was a division between the two unions involved, and they were able to bring in shift technology and working 24 hours at a plant and new technology. So it lost a lot of jobs for it in exchange for extra pay. And so that was the capitalist strategy. You offer workers a bit of extra pay, at the same time we're going to really stuff over your conditions, right? And you're going to lose a lot of jobs. So it was a major defeat. The second big defeat was this massive strike, and it was turned into a lockout in Kawerau, the Tasman mill there. There was one union that held out called the Pulpies, Paper Workers Northern Federation. Murphy's Mob, exactly. And there's this huge PR campaign against John Murphy, who's up there on the left, and the Pulpies, who were largely Māori workforce. And unfortunately, the maintenance unions, that we talked about earlier with Kinleith, didn't go with the Pulpies. I think only the Boilermakers supported the Pulpies. And so they held out, trying to stop job losses. Right? That was the major issue there at Tasman. So this is like Ron Trotter with Fletcher Challenge overtaking this mill and trying to really get rid of a whole lot of jobs there. And the Pulpies they got locked out, and unfortunately they had to go back and were defeated by and large, unfortunately. 2 minutes, okay. I'll get to the conclusion. I do want to mention the Nissan Way strike is another really important strike. So a lot of unions start to move towards the right in the 80s. This is the engineers union, start proposing what's called partnership stuff, and they basically try and enforce the Nissan way of production, where workers are really highly dominated, really highly regimented, have to work really fast in teams and compete with each other. And engineers go for it, they think this is a great idea, right? And they enforce it on other workers, and other workers at this car plant go on strike against them, the stores workers and so forth, and not the engineers, even though there was a struggle within the engineers union as well to do this. And unfortunately, the Nissan way, I think, got imposed in that part. Anyway, so on to, I did have a quote from the PSA organiser, but I might skip that, talking about how the PSA went into full-blown retreat because there's huge restructuring within the state, workers going like dominoes, and it was very hard to fight. So the Nissan way, Boss's way, as it was called, strike. And this is a quote, I don't know, there won't be any time to read it, but basically a worker going to engineers union meeting. They voted for a strike, and the engineers union officials, including Jim Butterworth, who spoke earlier at Kinleith, who appeared to be militant, going completely the other way and telling them not to strike. Actually, being very undemocratically ignoring strike votes, right? I think that's a fantastic quote, by the way, from Tony Simpson about partnership. Basically, how can you propose partnership? This is a view from the left. How can you propose partnership with capital, with neoliberalism, when you're not in a position to be able to, you're just going to concede, right? So on to conclusion. But basically what I wanted to say, the most successful struggles around the world against restructuring, the ones that involved heaps of community support, what you've seen in Kinleith, lots of bottom-up, rank-and-file democracy and unity, right? And allied with political support, which I mean parliamentary support, right? Unfortunately, a lot of those conditions weren't present in New Zealand. You had two parties, Labour and National, which were full-on for restructuring, right? So it was and then you had the global tide. It was very hard to fight, very hard to fight. So I think I would see it as a historic loss. And then the question is what to do about it, I think, rather than get into some interesting political debates about, what happened. Okay, sorry, it's a bit disorganised. This is a bit random.